And just like that, we are headed to hometowns week 5 this week. Some surprises for me in the final 4 picks that were not on my bingo card. Welcome to Reality TV Therapy with me, Dr. Diane. Welcome back to my channel, Reality TV Therapy. If you haven't subscribed, make sure to do that. Leave me a like and a comment because the algorithm really works that way. Secondarily, are you following my channel, Reframing Midlife? Because I just posted a video with my husband, Lyle, talking about what it's like to support your partner during midlife. And as you know, part of my story is my husband was a widower, and I just really want people to check that out because I think it was actually quite precious where I'm being more vulnerable in my videos, and I just want to make sure you know about that. Now, a little bit more housekeeping. I want to talk a little bit about a story about Joan that was brought to my attention by one of my followers, one of the comments last week, that did I know that John Vassos was waiting trial for a white-collar crime before he died. No, I didn't actually know this. So I did a little bit of sleuthing, not a ton, looked up on Google, and it is true that John, because he was, maybe I don't know how much these things are related, was a very generous guy, but somehow he was defrauding people in the state of Maryland to the tune of something like $600,000. So is this Joan's responsibility? No. How much did she know about this while she was the partner? There was some allegation, don't know if this is true, that they were separated before he became ill, but then they got back together. I could see that happening. I don't know what if this is true, nor do I hold Joan responsible for that. Having said that, a lot of people have been boycotting this season for God knows what reasons, because of Jen Tran, because of the men, because of Gil, because of Guy. And I just feel like you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. I personally, this is like my business, so I'm not going to stop watching based upon that. If you want to stop watching, I get that, but I think what we miss is, again, all the sweetness. This season for me, it's about the men. It's about the grief. It's about the healing that happens, as I talked about in my last video. And so I'm not quite sure if you think you're making the dent that you want to. Having said that, what I think is important about knowing about Joan is, should we expect Joan to be as transparent as we want the men to be with her? And is Joan hyping up her late husband, John, too much? So the men feel like, I can't compete with this idealized version of your late husband. And to me, it just makes a little bit more sense. I'm thinking about it now. Remember, she talked about the guilt that she feels. Maybe the guilt that she wasn't in the room when he passed. But maybe there's more to this story. I just don't know. I'm now aware of the story. It doesn't really change my opinion of Joan. And here's what I think. As long as she is being transparent with her final person. So say it's Chalk, because I feel like she's leaning that way. As long as she tells him about her past and her history, I don't feel like just because she's a public figure, all of us need to know about that. I think this is probably a shameful situation, as you can imagine, with her kids and feeling like he'd done something in their history. It doesn't mean he wasn't a great husband to her, that she didn't feel close to him, safe with him. So I just want to put that out there. Then Joan was on Jimmy Kimmel last night, and I kind of got the flavor that maybe she doesn't get engaged. I don't know if this is true or not, but she said all along she's going to do it differently. She's going to do fantasy suites differently. She might not get engaged. I think the message is about finding love later in life. It doesn't necessarily mean finding a fiance. So I'm going to be good with that too. And you can have a long distance, great relationship with someone and still find your person. And it doesn't have to look like all the other previous episodes. Okay, just for you to know, I'm well aware of the story and I have mixed feelings about it. Okay, that's enough. Let's start with episode 5, the opening scene. Pascal is in his white skivvies, steaming his clothes. I just don't really think I needed to see that. we've already seen Pascal's abs multiple times. We know he's in great shape. Good for him. He's doing his laundry. That was just, I don't know, a little too much for me. Then let's get to the group date. I actually love me a good bowling date. I do. I grew up in the Midwest. I used to go bowling with my dad. It's such a common thing, especially when the weather's bad. Everybody goes bowling. So Joan threw a strike. She knocked it out of the park. The guys all stepped up their game. The bowlers, we had Jonathan, Jordan, Guy, Chalk, Pascal, not comfortable with the polyester. This is not his typical kind of Gucci or Prada. And I just think there are just some funny little quirks and stories. But the men were getting a little bit jealous because Chalk kind of swoops in, sees Joan sitting alone, puts his arm around her, tucks her in. And the other men are like, dude, why are you doing this? But he's like, well, isn't this what we're supposed to be doing at this point? And we know that Chalk is all in. And let's face it, that is attractive. Because I'm going to talk about the people who I don't think are all in relative to that. Okay, so I thought the men also stepped up their game a little bit more when you see the private interactions with Joan and the men. And she's just going to have to cut some people. That's all that is that's happening. The final one-on-one dates are going to go to Keith and Mark. Keith, for me, ended up fumbling again. He fumbled last week. He lost his words. He just gets really nervous. And I feel like Keith's a really good guy, but we don't know, the story hasn't continued. The relationship hasn't progressed. We don't know much more about Keith besides that he's a girl dad. What else does Keith even do? Again, he lives in Silicon Valley near me. I just don't find out more about Keith unless they edited all of that out. But I had to admit, on their date in the winery, it was a little bit awkward because this couple's talking about that they've been married for 32 years. And it just changed the tone, right? The energy kind of shifted. And I felt like they couldn't quite get that back. So we don't see the end of the date. We do find out that Joan is not giving out roses on any of those dates. And I'm like, good for Joan. Owning her season. I'm not going to give out roses. Everybody needs to have the same amount of time. I actually really like this. I think it's better to go to the rose ceremony than to be giving out roses, which kind of sets the tone for everyone else. Now, here's what we really have to talk about. And I want to take a pause on this, is Mark. Mark, as you know, my Barbie doll here, I felt like Mark also missed a lot of opportunities. Don't come for me in the comments. I love Mark. I think he is kind and generous and has a wonderful smile. And I think he's more of a supportive partner. I don't know if he has main character energy though, because the rumor was that Mark was going to be the next Golden Bachelor. And I don't know if he has enough game, so to speak. All right. Well, first off, on the date itself, I felt like Mark just wasn't terribly comfortable even being on a yacht, right? He's calling it a boat. He's not quite sure. It just doesn't feel like someone who's really leaning into the experience. It feels like even he dressed a little bit more casually, and Joan comes in this beautiful dress, and I'm like, oh, Mark, you should have put on a pair of khakis or something. So it just felt a little bit mismatched. All right. Having said that, again, he's a wonderful man. Who would have loved this date would have been Pascal, though, right? Pascal, who would have just really leaned into that. And Joan's a little bit cold. I wanted him to wrap her in a blanket or do what Chalk did and say, come here, sweetheart, let me warm you up. But what was missing for me was really the relational part. Okay. Now, we've been here before in Bachelor Nation where people really love the person who's being the most vulnerable. He is adorable. He hypes the other men up. He is, again, a great supportive person. But with Joan, if I just look at that interaction, there's long pauses, long silences. It's like, Mark, where are you? Because we see this other guy with the men, and he seems more comfortable with the men than he does with Joan. So they bring out the date card to even liven it up, to give them something else to do. But Joan is stepping back. She doesn't want to be performing. And he's just not picking up the ball. Okay, so it felt like, again, it was his to lose. And that's why I'm saying there are missed opportunities. So let's talk a little bit more about vulnerability. Because as I say, we've been here before in Bachelor Nation. It was Tayshia's season, if you recall. And there was Ben, who was sharing a story about his depression, about his suicidality. Everybody just went crazy for this guy and his story and how great he is and he should be the next Bachelor. And I'm like, but listen to the story. That's a sad story. What is it like to be his partner? And I felt the same about Mark and a little bit with Charles too. And I love Charles and so sweet. But when you're leading in your new relationship with all your grief from your past relationship, you'd have to feel like, where is there space for me in this relationship? And that's what we get to a little bit later when Joan gives Mark that feedback. And she says, like, I love you, Mark, but I'm not in that conversation. So if Mark does become the Golden Bachelor, Mark, watch this video. Do some work on yourself. You have to start thinking about, yes, there's me being vulnerable, and I know the show pushes for that, right? Share your story. But you have to think about the context. You have to think about, how does this sound to the other person? Okay, take the hummingbird story. So when Mark is sharing this story with the guys, it's very appropriate. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be here. The hummingbird comes. This is my wife, open hand. The hummingbird comes to her, how amazing she is. And when he's talking about how healing it is and he's letting so many things off his shoulders, that's great. But when he's talking to Joan about it, you see she has a reaction to that, right? She's saying, now I'm thinking of John and how come he's not coming to me? And so now they're joining around their grief and they're joining around the fact that they have a shared common experience. But where is the future orientation? So if Mark were to say something like, Joan, you have given me so much hope. What I had in my relationship was in the past. What I'm looking for is something different with you. And I do love that we both have that similar story. We're going to hold our partners there, but we're going to build a new life together. That was the part that just felt like it was missing. So it's not just one thing to be vulnerable if it's one-sided. You have to think about, how is this going to land? And as a couples therapist, that's what I see, that you're not bringing the other person along in the story. So I thought that maybe Mark really does need a little bit more time, because here's the thing. I don't want to say whether Mark is ready or not. I don't want to say whether Joan is ready or not. My husband and I were talking about this. There's no script for like, okay, for every 10 years you were married, you need 3 years of grief. I don't think the formula works that way. Joan says she's ready. I'm going to take that at face value. Mark says he's getting ready. But the fact that he's 6 years out and she's 3 years out, she just feels more ready than he does, because he's in his sadness, because he's still in his grief about that. And the same thing with Charles. So you have to think about, I'm on a dating show with a new person. And here's the other thing. We as the viewers, we get to see all the competition and who's stepping up and who isn't. Mark doesn't know those conversations, right? He comes back from the date and truly believes that it was a wonderful date, that it was perfect, that he got to know her more. And the other men are like, damn, Mark, you're going to hometowns. Like, because he's such a loving guy with them, it's like, what's not to love? But they don't realize, again, what's filtering through, what's not really happening. And here's the comparison. Now we've got Chalk, who's saying, I'm crazy about you, Joan. I see a future with you. If I am the lead, if I'm Joan, and I've got one guy who is not quite ready versus another one who's proclaiming how much they like me and that they are ready, who's going to feel like a bigger risk? See, that's the problem. Mark at this point feels like it could actually be a little bit risky. Even though he was happily married, what if he comes to you at the end and says, I thought I was ready, but I'm not? This still feels like it would be dishonoring my late wife's memory. So that's where I want you to think about what you're sharing with people. Is that moving your relationship forward, or is it just falling flat? Okay, so that's what we have to stop the dialogue. It's not just about being vulnerable. It's about how does this fit in the context. And then, of course, Joan comes to Mark, which I love that about her. She doesn't want to announce it at a rose ceremony. She feels like because they have this shared story that they've bonded in, that she's going to take Mark aside and say all those important things.
Heart is mending, but I didn't see me in our conversations when we were talking. And I didn't feel like I imagined in us.
Like, this is important information. And if Mark does become the Golden Bachelor, I'm not saying he can't get there, because he's now in a very different role. When you're on the show and you're one of 25 versus you are the lead, it's incredibly different. It kind of amps you up in a different way. But he is, if he does become the Golden Bachelor, he's going to need a new narrative that doesn't feel like it has so much sadness, but it has more space and a potential for a new partner to come in. So let's get to that rose ceremony, because this was the surprising part. Now, many people thought that she was going to choose Keith and Jonathan. I thought she was going to choose Jonathan, perhaps, and I was a little bit surprised that she chose Pascal and Jordan. As I said last week, I felt like the date with Jordan, he hasn't been that revealing. Jordan to me felt a little flat also, but I do think Jordan was a little bit more confident than Keith. And when Joan says that she wants to feel safe, and she did say her husband John sort of lit up the room, I think she's going with the men that have more charisma. And let's face it, at the end of the day, Chalk has charisma, no doubt. Guy has charisma. Jordan, not as much. And then Pascal. So back to who's going to be more fun. Joan knows she's only going to end up choosing one person. Again, I think it's Chalk. But these other guys are really more about like who's going to make for fun TV, whose family am I going to enjoy meeting. And therefore, I think her choices were about that. I think Jonathan is lovely, but I don't think he did a great job also painting a picture of a future with Joan. And so unfortunately, she has to cut someone. And after all, Pascal is going to make for great TV, and he's going to make for a great hometown. Like, why not end up driving around in a sports car in Chicago, going to his salon? I just think I get it. And when it comes to Jonathan, I also cannot forget that I saw Joan's eyes shift, and when he talked about his wife getting up and suddenly leaving him, you can't tell me that that didn't make an impression with Joan. So I think that was the moment where Jonathan also lost it. So let's talk about what's coming up, because again, I always love hometowns. A little bit different than meeting parents. We're meeting kids, but we're seeing their lifestyle, where they live, how that works with Joan. And the preview, though, was very different, because one of the daughters, which I think it's Jordan's daughter, said something like, my dad is not going to be ready. And I was like, whoa, we haven't seen this before. On the Golden Bachelor, we saw all the family, so lovely, so welcoming. But here, someone is going to say, I don't think my dad is ready. And who knows if that's projection on her part or if that's really knowing her dad well. But that is what is to come. So let's just think about, again, the lessons we can learn on love, because that's why I do this channel. What can you learn? Learn to be vulnerable, but also learn to bring your partner along. Okay, don't let anyone tell you whether you're ready or not. You have to show that you're ready. You have to have good communication skills. You have to partner well. And that means not just at the beginning, but ongoing in your relationships. And you make sure that you're checking in also, even as the relationship goes on. So I hope you found that helpful. Let me know what you think about Mark leaving, what you think about him being the next Golden Bachelor. and if you agree with my analysis. And that is a wrap. We'll talk soon.